This is Zach from Worn and Wound, and today I'll be taking a look at the Halios Seaforth. Halios is a brand we've reviewed several times now on Worn and Wound. They are a boutique dive watch brand based out of Canada, and they're one that has kind of created quite a cult following for themselves. Their watches have an exceptional level of kind of design quality, really great build quality, very high value aspect to them as well. And they're often available in very limited numbers, regularly sold out, long pre-orders, things like that. So they have this kind of like genuine kind of cult quality where people seek them. He does pre-orders, they go very fast. And so whenever a new one comes out, it's really, big news for the kind of cult dive watch fan, and something that we're very excited about just because we happen to really like the watches. So the Seaforth here is a follow-up to a watch they released a couple of years ago called the Tropic. There were two versions of that, a stainless steel version with a bezel and a bronze version. We reviewed both of them on the site. And it was a very appealing watch. It was more of a kind of a casual diver style, had a bit of a vintage feel to it, but it had just really nice, unique elements to it that all came together for just a very appealing design. That's long sold out, definitely a desirable watch. I'm pretty sure those actually sell secondhand for more than they sold at retail, which is pretty exceptional for a modern, kind of boutique watch brand. And the Seaforth picks up the feeling of those watches, but is entirely a different watch. So it's a more casual sports style watch. There's dive elements to it, more kind of some classic sports elements to it. And it has some visual features really in line with the Tropic, particularly in the dial, but it's a whole new design. So it's not just a slight tweaking of that design, it has a totally different case and some very different options as well. So the Seaforth, it's an automatic movement, it's sapphire crystal, it's powered by the Miyota 90S5 movement. It comes in a variety of flavors and styles, and you can kind of mix and match to find the one that suits you. So there's 3 versions, or actually 4 versions technically, of the bezel. You have a sapphire insert bezel, which you see here. Then there's a steel bezel, which comes in 2 different designs, and then a bezel-free version. There's also 4 different dials, and those can mostly be mix and match, except for on the sapphire bezel here, which can only take this dial, the gilt dial, or the black dial. The Halios Seaforth comes in at $650 without a bezel and $675 with a bezel. So it has still very much maintained a really high value concept that the brand stays true to. And they're very exciting watches, so let's take a closer look. Part of what makes the Seaforth very appealing is that it mixes vintage style with a very kind of modern build and feel. So it's a 41 millimeter case with 47 millimeter lug length and 12 millimeter height. But a good portion of that height comes from this extremely tall boxed sapphire crystal, which will show you better in profile. The Tropic was also 41 millimeters, but that featured a cushion case design, whereas this has a much more classic design to it with long lugs, crown guards, etc. It's interesting to me that they were both 41 millimeters because you kept that kind of feeling very true, but I think they really nailed it, and that's why they stuck with it. 41 millimeters, I found it to be a very appealing size on the wrist, and it gave the watch just a nice amount of kind of sporty presence, but didn't feel like an oversized, excessive dive watch or tool watch in any way. In fact, it was very kind of casual and easy to wear, which you'll see on the wrist. So looking at the design from the top down, what really strikes you from above are these big, chunky lugs. And they're very thick and they're wide. As I said, they're 47 millimeters lengthwise, 20 millimeter lug width there. They have really nice brushing on the top, and then this very striking use of faceting polished bevels. So I personally really like a polished bevel, particularly on a dive watch. I think that just kind of speaks to the history of dive watches, but I don't like a fully polished dive watch. To me, that doesn't make sense. So this little use of polishing really kind of helps accentuate the geometry. But what they did that was cool was not only did they bevel it one direction, they beveled it the other. So the front of the lug also is beveled. And that creates just a very kind of striking look, really sharp geometry there. It helps downplay a little bit the size of the lugs, but still they're still very pronounced, very aggressive. Next, you'll notice the crown guards and crown on the right side. This has a 6.5 millimeter screw down crown by 4 millimeters long, so it's a pretty tall crown, definitely very easy to grasp. Has these two crown guards flanking it. They're kind of low and stout. They also feature a beveling on the edge there, ties them into the lugs, gives them a little bit of a dressing up, which I think works well with the design because it's not overly toolish, plays off of some of the characteristics of the dial, which has a little bit more of a formal build to it. And then next you'll obviously see the bezel, but we'll actually come back to the bezel in a minute. Looking at the case from the side, you can see how the geometry actually really helps downplay the height. Not that 12 millimeters is tall at all, especially for a nice sport watch, but there's a lot of breaks in the case side that help just kind of visually break it down and make it wear just very nicely. So starting, you have this very tall boxed sapphire crystal here. It's a gorgeous crystal, really helps kind of give it that vintage feel, but because it's sapphire, it's very scratch resistant. It looks beautiful on the watch. It's just a great detail. Obviously, if they had gone with a flat crystal, it would have almost been like a 10 millimeter case, but I really enjoy that crystal is there. It does a lot for the personality of the watch. Next, you have the bezel, and depending on which bezel option, that's going to actually change in height a little bit. So the steel bezel is about 2.2 millimeters thick. That exposes a nice amount of the crystal, gives you a nice amount of grip. The sapphire bezel, and I mentioned it's because it has an insert, is actually a little bit taller. So that comes out 3.3 millimeters. So the crystal's a little bit more hidden, and you just have these different different proportions to the lines, but both work really well. And then I just really enjoy the shape of the case side here. So the mid case looks very thin, but as you can see, it actually bevels back. So there's more underneath the watch than it looks like. And that's a really clever trick just to make the watch, once again, look and feel thinner and also wear flatter. And you can just see the quality of the finishing going on here. It's beautiful, bright, polished line, really gorgeous brushing. Because of how the lugs connect to the mid case visually, there's a little bit of a line that kind of comes in here and cuts in. It's just all very nice, creates a nice texture to it, a nice kind of rhythm of the forms. That's really, I just love the consideration to detail you find here. And that's not something you find on every brand at any price range, let alone at around $600. Crown here has Halios' 3 crescent moon logo on it. Very simple and just an effective use of branding there. Looking at the case back, it's an extremely plain case back. They went very minimal on this one. Obviously you see Seaforth automatic in 200 meters, 600 feet on there. Doesn't even say Halios. I will say on the Tropic, there was a little drawing in the middle of of one of these Capricorn goat creature type things. I happen to just like that was there. It was cool. Obviously, that does not really matter towards wearing the watch, but this is a little bit plain, but I can take it. Looking now at the bezel of the Seaforth. So as mentioned, there are actually 4 different bezel options. There's a sapphire insert, there's 2 different steel models, and then there's a fixed bezel or a non-ratcheting bezel. Looking now at the sapphire version, which is perhaps the most visually striking and speaks the most to vintage dive watches, you have this great looking insert here. I particularly actually like the way sapphire inserts look. They feel a little bit like old plastic inserts, acrylic or Bakelite, because of the way the sapphire creates depth. So there's a sheet underneath the sapphire, so you get a little bit of that kind of it's just a sheen to it and a little bit of an interesting reflection. And it just works really, really well with the vintage concept. Also plays off of the boxed sapphire crystal there. So now, no matter which version of the ratcheting bezel, you're going to have the same mechanism. So this has a 120 click ratcheting bezel. It's unidirectional, as you'd expect. It's very, very nice. It's something we've seen on all the Halios watches, is that the bezels are particularly well made, very tight. They land right on the mark. There's almost no backplay. You see, it clicks, it jumps back the tiniest bit after it clicks, but then it lands on the mark, and there's no wiggle whatsoever. So that just feels just particularly nice. One other interesting thing about the sapphire insert is that it is entirely loomed, or rather the dots and the numerals there are entirely loomed, so they have a really nice glow at night. Next version we want to show you is the stainless steel bezel, ratcheting bezel, but this is the version that copies the kind of classic dive style that you'll find on the sapphire bezel. So you have the same 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and the dots in between. Here they're filled in black, and then there's just lume at 12. So this kind of changes the feeling of the watch a bit. Gives it a little bit more of a casual feel, a little bit less of like a luxe sport diver. But I really quite like the look of it. It's a very appealing look. It's a little bit thinner, as I mentioned before, and the steel bezel actually ramps up a tiny bit. And then it has this nice brushing all around as well. So just visually, I think this was what you were looking for. You weren't into the vintage dive style or the sapphire bezel. And this offers a really nice alternative to that. Next is another version of the stainless steel bezel, which takes a little bit of a conceptual departure from the dive watch. So here you have a 12-hour bezel, which can be used obviously to set a second time zone. So you just adjust that, and then you can basically set it to several hours ahead of where you are or several hours behind, depending on how you want to use it. And what I like about that is it makes this just a little bit more of kind of a general sports watch, a traveling watch. I think for my own personal tastes and needs, that style of bezel might actually appeal to me the most. Lastly, and it's a big departure from the other series, is the fixed bezel or non-ratcheting bezel. So as you can see, the big bezel is entirely gone. You just have a classic look here. It's finished very well, is brushing around it. It looks extremely nice, but it has a very, very different presence to it. It's still a 41 millimeter watch. They didn't change the design at all, but by removing the bezel, obviously, it makes it more of kind of a general sport watch, an everyday watch, a casual watch. But if you're looking for something that's a little bit less aggressive, this is definitely an option. The dial of the Seaforth stays very true, actually, to what you'll find on the Tropic, though there are definite detail differences. So first of all, it comes in 4 colors, as I mentioned before. What we see here is the pastel blue. This is definitely the most exotic of the colors, the most unexpected. But it's a very appealing color and one that I think is really cool that they made. So you'll notice that the dial is kind of pale powder blue, though we call it pastel, and I think technically is. To me, pastel implies something even softer, perhaps. And this one is, I think, well accentuated by a nice use of black, which it puts some kind of masculinity back into it. It could have been a little too soft, say they had no light surrounds or there'd been stainless steel surrounds. But looking at the actual design here, which all 4 of the models have in common, you have a flat surface, and then you have a primary index of applied rectangular markers here with copious amounts of fill. So it's C3 lume on all the models. It glows extremely well. It's very bright, very, it stands out really well. And even when, not dark light, you can still even see that kind of nice green coming from the C3, which makes it pop a little bit. Around that, then, you have an index printed index for minutes and seconds. Very simple, very effective. One of the things that I think that is really done well with this watch, and frankly all Halios watches, is an attention to the subtle proportions. So with this kind of minimal amount of just forms and everything going on here, had the length spin off, had the width spin off, had the little things just felt wrong, this dial could have looked odd very quickly, but they nailed it. So the length of those markers feels right, the placement is from the distance from the edge feels right, the weight of the lines around it feel right. So they just nailed that. It's very pleasing dial, but very simple. Obviously at 12, then you have double rectangle to kind of distinguish the top of the watch, if you will. But otherwise, there's no changes around. One thing you'll also notice is that there is no date on this watch. The Tropic did have a date at 6. And, obviously date windows can be contentious. It's something I often can pick on with a brand. So no date, no issues there. I'm sure there's going to be people who wish there was a date, but that's for Halios to deal with. One thing I really liked, though, was that they used the Miyota 90S5 movement rather than the 9015. The difference there is that movement actually doesn't have a date. It's actually a skeletonized movement, interestingly enough, so that's why they removed the date, because if you were to view it, you wouldn't want to see that date disc there. So what that translates to, though, is that there's no phantom date position when you're setting the crown. And that, to me, is a very nice touch. It's very well considered. So just continuing to look at this one of the things I also really liked about the Tropic that they've kept in the Seaforth are the hands. Just a very well-designed set of hands, very appealing looking. They're sort of a fence post style. They're slightly three-dimensional, so there's a little ridge going down them. Honestly, here the black is probably the hardest to notice that on, but we'll show you the other colors and you'll be able to see it. And then they feature this diamond-shaped plot of loom. It's just very attractive looking. It's like a very normal design that's been just nuanced a little bit to be more appealing. I don't really know what to say other than that. It comes across very well. They have a nice level of craft and finish to them. The second hand then is a stick with a loomed rectangle towards its tip. Looking now at the black gilt dial version, this is probably the most striking version. It's definitely the one that definitely has called out to me. I'm a big fan of gilt dials, or very subtle use of gold on a watch. Obviously, there was a Seiko SRP 775 we reviewed a little while ago, and they had a similar thing. I really like it. It speaks to vintage watches. What I liked here, too, is that they didn't use any kind of faux gilt print. Instead, they used these golden surrounds and golden hands. It looks great on the black. Here, you can see a little bit more of the dimensionality in the hands. Just a very striking look. Here, the surface is actually not matte. It is glossy, and that gives the black a really nice, just inky depth to it that looks great. Next, you just have the kind of black silver dial, so very similar to the gilt, except for everything that's gold is now polished steel color. This is the most classic version that they made. It's you simply just can't go wrong with it if you're looking for kind of a tried and true look. This one took me the most by surprise, and this is the Sunburst Blue. It's the only Sunburst you have here, and for me, I've gotten just a little tired of Sunburst dials, as we've seen so many of them. Sometimes they look great, sometimes they look kind of cheesy. This one looks great. The choice of blue here was just perfect. It's almost a teal. It has just enough green in there to subdue the blue. It's very muted, but it picks up nice, flecks of light. So sometimes the blue kind of comes through a little bit more. It has, because it's sunburst, it still feels a little bit metallic. It's paired with a white index around, and then stainless steel surrounds on the markers and stainless steel on the hands. It's just extremely appealing, and I think actually in this combination works particularly well. I really like the way it looks with this stainless steel bezel, and because this is that 12-hour bezel, this watch has felt very different from the other ones despite having a very similar design, and I found that kind of just casual sport watch, knowing it's like a 200-meter, very discreet but still sturdy and attractive sport watch, just very, very appealing. On the wrist, the Seaforth really shines. I think it fits exceptionally well. It almost felt like it was tailor-made for my wrist. I mean, when I put this thing on and first strapped it on, all of the styles, not just the sapphire style here, it just felt perfect on my wrist. The 41 millimeters is nice and broad. It has a nice scale to it. Really good for like a sport watch, a dive watch. I definitely have said I prefer watches that are smaller, but I feel like dive watches need to be in this sort of 40 millimeter range. This at 41 millimeter has just enough real estate to kind of really get the dial across, get a nice size bezel, really good proportions. And then the 47 millimeter lug to lug just fits so well across my 7-inch wrist. But the lugs themselves, though being, kind of almost a short lug to lug for a watch this size, really still have a nice amount of presence because they're so chunky. So it just feels really solid and really stout. It has a great profile to it. I wouldn't change a thing in terms of the size on this watch. I think it wears exceptionally well. It's really comfortable. The height feels good. Like I said, it's 12 millimeters, but Some of that, a couple millimeters, come from the glass, so you can kind of already cancel that. And then because of the design, the different levels of the case, and because the mid case really scoops underneath, it wears very flat and very comfortable, particularly for a sport watch. I mean, it is a 200-meter watch, which isn't like a crazy amount of depth, but it's not really meant to be a insane tool watch. You know, Halios makes the 1,000-meter puck if you're looking for that kind of a thing. This is just supposed to be, you know, a very stylish but still very purposeful sport watch, and I think, you know, they really nailed it. Looking now, you know, like I said, this one with the sapphire bezel, it's just so appealing, especially if you've been into vintage dive watches, you know, 50 fathoms, things like that. This speaks to those, but doesn't look, you know, like them. It's not an homage to those watches, and it's more stylized, so it doesn't feel like it's a watch that was plucked from a catalog back then either. It just has really nice vintage cues to it, but it's very much a modern watch, which I personally really like. The fixed bezel model still wears extremely well, but definitely feels different than the bezeled models. I definitely came to like the bezeled models more when I was wearing them because the proportions with the bezel just felt really nice to me. That a little bit of extra kind of masculine sort of aggressiveness from the bezels also really worked at the 41 millimeters. To me, this feels conceptually like it's along the lines of the bezel-less Tudor Black Bays to maybe something like a Sin 556i. Like it's a casual but still very purposeful sport watch with somewhat more formal elements coming from the dial. Obviously here you have the pastel blue dial, but any of the other dials you've seen could be in this one. So for example, if you did the black gilt dial, this had a much more striking, verging on kind of a sporty dress look to it. I feel like, you know, it depends on entirely what you're looking for, but to me this is almost a different watch, and I almost wish it was a little bit more different from the other versions. Like it could have come down a couple millimeters since there is no bezel. Maybe the crown guard could have been removed, but at that point you're talking about totally different tooling and everything. I think it's still very interesting that they made this alongside of the bezeled version, and I think a lot of people will find this appealing. I mean, if you are particularly interested in something like the Black Bay bezel-less, but are not looking to pay, you know, $3,500 for a watch, but you want that, you know, just kind of everyday sport watch feel for it, but a little bit on the larger side, this is definitely something that's going to be interesting to you. While we're on it, actually, one really great thing about this watch is the straps they come with. So they come with 2 leather straps each. I'm not 100% sure of the combinations that you'll get, but they are very high quality, really nice leather here, beveled and painted edges, hand-tied knots, nice buckle that actually says Halios on the back side. Just a really nice feeling of quality. I was pleasantly surprised by the leather here. These feel like very nice third-party like straps you'd add to a watch after the fact. To wrap up, the Halios Seaforth, I think, is a very successful follow-up to their now long sold-out Tropic models. The mix and match concept here with the different steel bezels, the sapphire bezel, the 4 colored dials, gives you a lot of options to play with, so I think you'll definitely be able to find a version that's right for you. And the 3 or 4 different versions, but I'll call it 3 sapphire steel and fixed bezel, also give you 3 very different feels to it. So you have the really kind of implicitly vintage diver with the sapphire. You have the more kind of casual, everyday bezeled sports watch with the steel bezels. And then you have this more discreet sort of almost dress sport watch with the fixed bezel version. Depending on then, you know, throw the dials around, you can really make something that I think feels unique and suits you. At $650 for the fixed bezel, $675 for the bezel versions. These are extremely well-priced watches. I have no qualms at all with the price. If anything, I think they're extremely well-priced. These are beautifully made watches with unique designs, and you know that's something that obviously can cost many, many times more than this. I guess, you know, the only question is which version's right for you and if you can pick one up before they're all sold out. Please read the full review on wornandwound.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.